This week on Influence, how we all can fight misinformation and disinformation on social media, even when it's in a different language. Hello, listeners. Hello, viewers. Welcome back to Influence. Thanks for spending another week with me. My name is Matt Silverman. My name is in the title of the show. That's how you can remember it. It's there for your convenience if you don't know who's talking. I have been covering internet culture, technology, and online communities for 10,000 years, and it's exhausting, but I can't stop being obsessed with it. And if you've been listening to this show or its previous incarnation for any length of time, you know that we are inspired by internet creators who make the cool stuff that we like to watch, listen to, read, and scroll through on this World Wide Web and information superhighway that we love so much. But occasionally we run into some stuff that's not as fun, not as good. We've covered it on this feed quite a bit with experts, journalists. It's misinformation, it's disinformation, it's the stuff that you look at and you're like, no, stop, don't click on this, don't listen to this thing. It's not where you want to be on the internet. So we're not going to have those people on the show. We don't want to bring those people on here. That's not what we want. But we do need experts. We do need people doing what I like to call the Lord's work to make sure that these disinformation peddlers don't get into the feeds of the people we care about and ourselves. We're also susceptible to it. That is what has brought me to today's conversation with my excellent guest. Lam Vo is an investigative reporter and data journalist. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. Whose work has been featured in some up-and-coming indie journalism websites. I don't know if you've heard of any of these. NPR, The Wall Street Journal, Al Jazeera, America, and BuzzFeed News. Currently, she works for a lot of places. We'll talk about that as well. But the reason I found her today is because she has written some extraordinary pieces, a whole series, at a website called the Markup, which I highly recommend. I will link to it in the show notes. It is, I'm going to quote them, it's a nonprofit newsroom that investigates how powerful institutions are using technology to change our society. Basically, if you have concerns about the way technology is changing, influencing, damaging this world, you should be reading the Markup. You should subscribe to the newsletter because then it just electronically puts it into your inbox. You get mail, but it's not like the post office. It's digital. It's electronic. Comes into your inbox, and then you're like, oh, I should know about this. They do extraordinary work, and I wanted to remind everyone to get some nonprofit news sources into your daily news consumption. I highly recommend it, and that is why we are here today. Lam, I'm gonna hopefully say this correctly. She'll correct me. Lam Thuy Vo, welcome to Influence. Oh, she gave me the thumbs up. Yes. Hi.
Hi. How's it going?
Did I do it okay? Your name?
You did great.
Yes. How are you?
I'm great. I'm wonderful. It is very hot here in New York City.
Yes. I am geographically near you. I'm not in New York City, but I'm close enough. And we've had some warm days. Hopefully you've been traveling, but hopefully you're getting some sun or going to the beach or something.
Yeah. I love the outdoors. Even though I cover technology, I love being outside and rolling around in dirt, whether it's as a potter or as a rock climber or just like walking around and biking.
Wait, did you say as a potter?
Yeah, I do pottery.
You do pottery?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have the wheel?
Yeah, I teach pottery too.
Wow,
I have many jobs.
Stop doing all the things. We're going to talk about many of your jobs. But first, look, when I bring creators on here, you are a creator, of course, but when I bring influencers on, I say, oh, how do people talk about what you do for a living and stuff? But we're going to cover that, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But I was hoping you are a person of Vietnamese descent, or perhaps, I don't know, were you born in Vietnam, or your parents, grandparents?
No, I was born in Germany. My father came as a student and fell in love with a girl in Saigon, wrote her letters for 9 years, and then married her at some point, brought her over. She came as a refugee, and then I was born in Germany.
Okay. But you speak Vietnamese, or you spoke it in your household growing up. Is that correct?
Yep. Yes. And so I know my level of Vietnamese is that of like a maybe a sophisticated 8-year-old who knows how to maybe bargain and make jokes, but does not know how to have political conversations.
So
this is very weird.
In that spirit, could you share with me and our listeners maybe a phrase, a greeting, something that we could take away from today's conversation?
So I toggled between teaching you how to cuss in Vietnamese.
Yes. Okay.
But it's like a very innocuous one, or to describe a person who is really annoying. I think both of them can be very useful.
I mean, we could combine these if we're being honest.
No, as a storyteller, I think what might be interesting to you is like one of my favorite phrases in Vietnamese that my mom would use to describe people who were really annoying and kind of like, that person who comes to your life and somehow there's a cloud of drama around them at all times. They're like their own telenovela.
But they are the first to point out that everything else and everyone else is dramatic and causing them drama. But then you're like, I think it's you.
Correct.
Okay.
So there's a really wonderful term that my mom would be like, "Con nhỏ đã nhiều chuyện quá," which means it's like, that girl has so many stories, meaning there's so many stories surrounding her at all times.
That's cool.
Nhiều means many.
Okay.
Giang means story. And so you're just like, that girl is just attracting a lot of stories.
Right. It's not the word for drama or agita, annoyance. It's stories. Stories are surrounding this person. I love that turn of phrase. Okay, love that. All right, we got to get some cuss words in here too. What do you got?
Okay, I think because this comes from my parents, right? Like, remember that what I am is what they call a heritage speaker, someone who learned it at the household, understands a lot, but doesn't know how to speak it. There's actually entire classes being taught to heritage speakers now who want to expand their vocabulary. But my mom would be like, "Mày ngu như con bò," which means like, you are as stupid as a cow. And it's like, okay. So it's like silly things like that I grew up with. It's not really nefarious or terrible. Like, I would not know how to say the F word in Vietnamese, but I know how to say that you're as stupid as a cow.
Stupid. All right. I may need to use that phrase, but in English with my children. We'll see how that goes. So you have 10,000 jobs, and we're going to talk about one in particular today, of course. But what's your background? How did you get into this world? What do you do?
So for the most part, I make my money being a journalist, right? I'm a reporter who uses technical skills to mine and understand data and to point out trends and anomalies and then connect that back to real people. And so the way in which I connect to misinformation is that since 2016 or 2015, 2016, I started covering the internet at large, sort of understanding online dynamics, how media ecosystems on the internet work, and misinformation on the internet works. And I started mining data from the social web, though, like in 2013. So it's been like more than 10 years. Yeah. Mostly through personal projects. I did a really silly Tumblr called Quantified Breakup, where I looked into the data that is left behind, that I left behind on the internet and other devices, to then look through it to see whether I was recovering emotionally from a breakup.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was my foray into understanding social media data. I learned at that point in time that the average person leaves behind, the average office worker leaves behind approximately 5 gigabytes per day. That was according to MIT Tech Review in 2013. And now
of just doing normal work tasks and personal tasks, you are creating 5 gigabytes of data at your desk a day, and that is sitting on the computer or on the web. or being collected by various
Correct.
platforms. Interesting.
Just data storage at large, right? And I think that includes using digital forensics to go into your computer and see where you deleted and created a file and like how many words you created and so on. Like that was sort of like a statistic from 2013 that really fascinated me. And I was like, what would happen if I looked into that? And then a different person who actually found the Tumblr and wrote about it coined this the quantified selfie. And I think that's sort of a method that that I got really excited about, because I think sometimes digital footprints are an even more precise record of your memory. Right?
Yes.
And we've gone from a default of forgetting to a default of remembering in digitally assisted ways, which is kind of like has a double-edged sword. And so, that's how I got into mining social media and mining data from the web to better understand first how people feel and what people are doing, and then to really look at it from a stance of misinformation, media ecosystems, who the players are in different ecosystems, all of that fun stuff.
You have crystallized something that I think about a lot, which is this forgetting versus remembering. And I think about it too of like, whatever I just did, I completely forgot it, but I can go back and piece together exactly the thing. And it's very helpful in my life and line of work, trying to create digital things, but then also that is constantly being weaponized and commercialized by everything, app, device that we touch. And obviously we're going to talk about that today. But when you really step back and look at, I just left 5 gigabytes of, or more, because that was 2013. It's probably doubled or tripled by now, right? I just left that on my desk for Meta to mine and serve ads and political, dissidents or, disinformation actors to fuck with. That's where normal people, that's where you and I, and a lot of listeners are like, oh shit. And normal people are like, what are you talking about? Which is why we need your journalism to explain what the heck is going on. So before we get a little further here, you just won an award, if I may tout your accomplishments here. This series we're going to talk about here, the Excellence in Online Journalism Award from the Asian American Journalists Association. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And have you accepted this award? Was there a ceremony? Is this meaningful to you? Is this an important award? And I don't mean to, you don't have to like crap on the award if it's not a big deal, but like,
No. I have mixed feelings about awards in journalism, and that might go too much into industry work. But I think on the one hand, it's a really beautiful acknowledgement from your peers that they respect your work and they really like it. And I think on the other hand, and I think with the Asian American Journalists Association, it's a very specific one. It is from a community that is often underrepresented in newsrooms, acknowledging what we have done. And that, to me, is a bigger honor than some of the other ones, because on the other hand, some journalists write stories just to win an award. And I think sometimes you don't want to have that be your raison d'etre. And so I think between those two, I always struggle between like, I do the work to have a particular understanding of, or like to actualize change to some degree. I want to give people the information they need to make the best decisions about their lives. And that should be my North Star. An award is nice. And I really acknowledge the work that also goes into that. And it's an acknowledgement of everyone. But regardless, all of this throat clearing is to say, I'm happy about it, but I'm particularly happy because part of the series is about, my editor coined it the languages of misinformation. And one of the things that I realized is that I had been covering misinformation since 2016, right? And mining social media data even before that. And one of the things that I realized is 2 issues. Number one, for the beginning years of misinformation coverage, we were fascinated by the problem. We would keep on pointing out to people, this is so bad, this is so terrible, and then leave them with no solutions. Right.
Right.
And so now we have this like, but it's the problem because we have
that's a fantastic point. Yeah.
Right. Because we became so good at pointing out the problem and describing it and how it came about that we forgot who this journalism was for, and we left them just disenfranchised.
I don't know what the solution is, aside from like stop using Facebook, stop looking at this stuff, stop. But that's like useless at platitudes and advice. But that's all I got. I don't know. What do you got?
I can give you get more into that. Let me finish the thought about the thing before I get too much into it. And then the other point that I wanted to make is that most misinformation coverage has been in English. And like one of the things that I realized is that if you ask any child of immigrants in the US about their aunties and uncles, the platforms they use, whether it's Viber, which is a chatting platform in the Vietnamese community, also in the Filipino community, or WhatsApp in Indian or largely South Asian communities, or WeChat in Chinese communities. All of them are like, I don't know how, but my uncle or my auntie or my mom or my dad are consuming heaps and heaps of misinformation.
Right.
And like, here's the interesting thing. I wanted to connect the research I had done into a community and give them information that they needed to navigate this field and to come up with solutions so that they don't feel like they're completely just being told, don't use this, now sit back and just be isolated in your room and not use any social media.
Because these apps are the digital connective tissue of all communities, but clearly very, very vital to immigrant communities and diaspora communities.
Especially because their lives are tethered to their home country as well as to where they are now. And the main reason why I'm really excited about this award is because there's a grandmother who I helped profile. Her name is my boy. And her and I collaborated on an essay about her initiative as a retiree to come out of retirement. She used to be a software engineer, had never done any journalism, but saw that her community was mostly consuming far right-leaning, oftentimes misleading information that was translated by YouTubers. And so she has 6 subscriptions to mainstream news organizations that she mines every week for information. And she translates a lot of these articles, largely about Donald Trump, but also other issues, for the Vietnamese community, and became a YouTuber at the tender age of 67.
She's my hero. I loved your piece, and I loved all the things she had to say about what she's doing and why she's doing it. Because she saw the problem, and like you said, no one is addressing this, so I guess I'll do it. And she did it.
And the best part is that we put her name onto the award application too. So Maya is now an award-winning journalist at the age of 67, and I get to bring her to the gala. So I'm bringing her.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I didn't
her
realize.
And I'm going to share a hotel room. It's very cute.
Oh my gosh, she is phenomenal. Okay, you're touching on a lot of my questions already, but you know, you have spent in your work. You are spending time with the Vietnamese immigrant community and Vietnamese language community, and a lot, like you said, a lot of older, middle-aged and older folks. And you're like, hey, what's up? You know, are you aware of AI and deepfakes and all this stuff? And they're like, what are you talking about? And you've written a lot about this. And so, you know, when you explain that to them, how do you work through it with them? You know, how do you give them the tools to be aware of it and then also to like spot it and become skeptical of this stuff?
So I've taught things around misinformation, so lessons and workshops around misinformation for a long time. Part of it was also with teenagers in Alaska, as well as people in newsrooms. And one of the things I noticed is that teaching people about misinformation is actually really great because you can do these games with them where you show them 2 pictures and you're like, here's a picture that was made with AI and here's another picture that was not made with AI. Which one is real and which one's fake? And I think if you're not expecting misinformation, it's very easy to just kind of consume it and then be outraged about things. And I think the biggest thing that I remembered was I work with largely 2 or 3 communities of Vietnamese folks. There's the an organization that my uncle started in Oakland, where he has been serving free meals to largely political asylees as well as new immigrants to the U.S. who are have very limited knowledge of English. And those folks, I came into that room with people who are between 50 and 70 or 80 years old, and none of them had ever heard of AI.
Right.
And we were like, oh my goodness, how do we even explain this?
Because it's in our world, it's every headline,
Yes.
every tweet, it is a nonstop conversation. So then to like hop over next door to the house next door, and they're like, "What are you talking about?"
Right.
It's just wild when you really think about that.
And that kind of comes to show that kind of is actually proving the point of what happened with social media news consumption. We are living in our own filter bubbles, right? Like every bubble is slightly different. And for the Vietnamese and for people of lower income, on people who have very little English knowledge of the English language, a lot of it is based on their existing interests. And so what I've seen so far was when I'm one of the community members of that sort of working class Vietnamese elder community, donated her YouTube viewing history to me. And so I was able to scrape through it and see a third of her consumption was news, sort of loosely defined, some YouTube influencers and some people who are sort of like legit ethnic media from Vietnamese background. So I like newspapers that have existed since the 70s. And then there was a lot of searching for and looking at health information, right? Like if you don't know how to access the system in the US and you don't know what you're eligible for, and you might not be having a full-time job that provides you with insurance, you're looking up how to protect yourself from COVID. You're looking up how to like cure maybe like a bout of food poisoning and so on. And so a lot of this information is indicative of the information needs of a community that's very working class.
Yes.
And it makes total sense. You and I have the luxury of sitting there and kind of like thinking about, oh, what does AI mean for society?
Right.
These folks probably have to spend way more time like looking up ways of getting their, stimulus check, health insurance and all of these things. Like that's the type of stuff that they need to navigate in the new country with a new language. And
you're getting at you're setting up this conversation beautifully of like pointing out how susceptible people are, people who speak little or no English are to the wrong information. Because English information, there's plenty of English misinformation, but there is official, correct, quote unquote, plenty of that to find in English. But there is so little of it in other languages. And then to your point, and this is obvious, but I just have to like say it out loud of like, even if someone in this community gave me their YouTube history and I peered inside their filter bubble, I would have no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And that makes it impossible to understand how fraught these bubbles are unless a journalist like yourself is decoding this for the rest of us.
Right. And I think, I mean, like one of the things I want to establish is that a lot of these viewers are also very sophisticated.
Yeah.
The most surprising thing that I learned was that when I told them about one YouTuber who was translating a lot of Gateway Pundit and like Newsmax and Breitbart, like far right and oftentimes scored as misleading sort of like news organizations into Vietnamese, they were like, oh, I know this woman is someone I can't trust, but this is what I have. Right. And so
interesting.
I think there's a lot of like, I think this idea of us by virtue of consuming something, being completely convinced of it is something that's actually some scholars have been disputing a little bit.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that also still means that there's a vacuum of useful information. And one of the things that's also really helpful to think about is that misinformation is high level sort of news that does not actually pertain to your day to day.
Yes.
that is very polarizing, right? Like most of it is about Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Right.
How much do Donald Trump and Joe Biden actually impact our lives on a local level, especially when you're like an immigrant who relies on, you know, food stamps or like on Medicare or Medicaid and so on. And so understanding that the information you're fed does not pertain to your day-to-day life is kind of making you angry or sad sometimes. But then when it comes down to it, you're still left with an information vacuum, right? Like a need for information that you don't get is something that I think is a missed opportunity for people who cover misinformation, right?
Right.
I went back to that very same community and I was like, based on this YouTube history and based on what you told me, you actually want information about housing in Oakland. You actually want to understand how to get healthcare in your language. Here are 5 NGOs that you can contact. And that empowers rather than scolds people.
Yes.
And I think on top of that, there's like a very particular cultural dynamic at play. I am about 30, 40 years younger than most of these Vietnamese elders. And it would be very, very disrespectful for me to come to my elders and be like, you don't understand news. You're too stupid to understand news, which I don't think is the truth. These folks have gone through like terrible, like my uncle was in a re-education camp in Vietnam. So he went through a lot of propaganda, sort of like communist propaganda camps, as well as like repressive regimes. If you ask any descendant of a refugee, you ask them about their parents, they actually are extremely smart about media literacy. But for that, they need to understand it. Right?
Meaning that they are inherently skeptical or distrustful of certain media because they lived through a repressive regime or government. Yeah.
Right. Where official government bodies and where official sources were tied to governmental institutions, right? Okay. And so that's an interesting insight that even when I speak to friends of mine whose parents are immigrants as well, they're like, yeah, my parents are actually some of the savviest people who will also attentively, if they can speak and access those sources, listen to every single like institution. They will listen to Fox News and like the New York Times and all of these things.
They'll
and then
gather
kind of
it
piece
up
together.
and then make a decision. So this is making me wonder about where is the, like, for example, Vietnamese language media, and is it a market problem? Meaning, like, there are plenty of Spanish language news outlets and entertainment outlets because the Spanish speaking population in the US is many millions of people. So there is a market incentive for companies or outlets to produce content in that language. So is there not enough addressable market in Vietnamese for there to be a CNN Vietnamese channel?
So it's interesting that you mentioned this. I think what's interesting specifically about immigrant diasporas is that they have a very particular need for information that is not one-on-one with what Vietnamese news producers would produce. So there is the equivalent of a Vietnam CNN, like Vietnamese CNN, but it's in Vietnam and it's covering Vietnamese news for the Vietnamese.
Yeah, for sure.
And in the US, I think, look at our media ecosystem. If we are looking at massive layoffs and like the shuttering of newspapers across
there's not
the country.
Enough money to go around for English language media, so, let alone
a
smaller
subset.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So I'm not asking you like what's the solution, but like I guess what I'm fearing is that there is no incentive for foreign language media to operate in the US with the exception of Spanish, probably. Hispanic
That's a
and
large
Spanish.
enough place, right? Like Telemundo and Univision do an excellent job of like doing long form investigations as well as fast news, like turnaround and stuff like that. And that's still like a fraction of like the media ecosystem that is available to us in English, right? I think for even smaller diaspora, and I think that goes to the idea of like, I think we have this idea of Asian American when we think about communities, but then within Asian American, you have so many small sub communities that right, that need specific information that they don't get.
Linguistically alone, there you cannot address the Asian
Correct.
American market. That's not a thing when it
Right.
comes to media.
And what's even more interesting is that a lot of news in those diasporas actually has to address this interesting new culture that has been created by being in the US, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a terrible analogy that I love from Jurassic Park, where you know how they recreate dinosaurs from like a mosquito in amber, frozen in amber.
Yeah. I've watched the documentary Jurassic Park, and I'm very familiar with it.
Imagine cultures being exported like that. A
Yeah,
culture is
totally.
frozen in time from
Yes.
1975, which is when
Totally.
the Vietnam War ended,
Right.
brought to California, brought to Texas, and then that culture with its values in there gets frozen in time and sort of like morphs with American culture as well. And that requires specific cultural knowledge when you're addressing that audience with news.
Yes.
So that Vietnamese, so one of the YouTubers that I analyzed, that person does a lot about Donald Trump, which sure is like polarizing content and so on. And a Pew poll recently showed that the Vietnamese community is the most pro-Trump out of all of the Asian communities in that survey.
Yeah.
51% of Vietnamese people are now pro-Republican, which is interesting, which is counter the trend of general like Asian diaspora.
I have questions about this
later
as we go, but please,
But within that, I think this YouTuber addresses a lot of issues around like China. So there's a long-term history of bad relations between China and Vietnam, coming from China colonizing Vietnam, and then sort of like just this general suspicion gets translated into what is covered and how it's covered, right? Like how pro-communist China some folks are and so on. That's what one of this YouTuber was like really focusing on. And that runs deep in sort of like a lot of Vietnamese communities that are very suspicious of communism at large, and also of how they're looking at politics. And so Biden's stance or Trump's stance on China actually matters a lot to people in the Vietnamese community, because of that history and because of that trauma that was frozen in time and brought to the U.S.
See,
and I think
I ignorantly thought that it like I knew it was more than just linguistics, but like you're identifying subsets of subsets of like it's a language bubble that is small in itself and impenetrable to the from the outside, and then within that bubble there's cultural bubbles that where that even so. And this actually this came to my mind as you were talking about the sort of translation issue. Like, hey, what if we could use AI to translate mainstream media to do what that amazing Vietnamese grandmother was doing as a human? What if we could translate NPR and the New York Times into Vietnamese really quickly with AI and then provide it to this community? And what I think you're saying is like, that's fine, but it probably won't even be covering the specific things that really matter to these people through the lens that makes sense to them.
Correct. And I think that's the biggest misconception of people being like, oh, I'm going to make this accessible to the community and just translate it, right? There was a great project, for example, from ProPublica that did very similar things to what I was doing with the community, where they figured out that a lot of their community members, Spanish-speaking community members, working class, I think this was a series about workers and how they were being treated. They went onto radio stations and started working with the community to find ways of giving information, not the whole 12,000 word tome that they would produce about the story, but the information that was necessary for those communities, and brought that there. And I think that is a thing that a lot of smaller news nonprofits are experimenting with. How do we make it culturally appropriate? How do we make selections about news that is also culturally appropriate?
Because you need people this, and I was thinking about this morning as I was getting ready to talk to you. The only way to do this is to have people like yourself and this wonderful grandmother and whoever's working at ProPublica to be the human cultural cultural translator as well to filter that, to take a 12,000 word article and distill it down to the relevant pieces to inform a voting public and also in their language. And again, to me, it gets back to like, it's not really a market issue for journalism, but it does matter. Even if we can step back and say like, hey, I'm just a white guy from New York. What do I care? What? Well, if getting the correct and contextually relevant information to people who are voting, that suddenly becomes really important to like civil discourse and the world, the country. And in that context, it's like, oh shit, we got to figure this out, you know?
Oh yeah, we do. And we not only do we have to figure it out here, we also have to figure it out everywhere in the world. And I think the thing that you mentioned about like I could use AI to translate, can I tell you something fun? So part of my coverage, part of my job is to investigate and look at AI and look at its not just like its opportunities, but oftentimes to kind of look into stress test the technology. And so one test that I did is that OpenAI, right, the leader of large language models and sort of generative AI in some ways, open sourced their platform Whisper. It's a model that allows you to auto transcribe audio into language, right?
Is that a Whisper is the transcription tool? Is that
yes?
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
So they power that transcription tool with the same, from what I understand, the same software that they just open sourced. So you can run this software on your local computer, and they have multiple languages in it. I auto transcribed about 700 videos in Vietnamese, and I just randomly picked 5 or 6 and gave them to a set of Vietnamese translators, and they were terrified by what they saw. They were like, God, this is not even Vietnamese, this is Laotian or whatnot, and so on. And that comes down to training data.
The training I was about to ask that.
So in many ways, training data is largely concentrated from the US market, which is also why we have the rest of the world did a great examination into like what generative AI, like what pictures generative AI produced when we asked, what does an Indian person look like to you? What make a picture of a Nigerian person? They all looked very stereotypically like some had turbans and so on. Others had like a headpiece and a head wrap. And it's like, if you go to Lagos today, you're like, that's not how Nigerians look, right? Like, and so understanding that the data is concentrated on a Western outlook and then used in different linguistic contexts, that should show you that it really failed the test over and over again. But the problem is that most tech companies won't move unless the US Congress tells them something. And most of these issues go undetected for a long time unless someone beats the drum for a long, long time. We had that happen
and also
with Myanmar,
there's no...
right?
You've identified a clear solution or a path forward, which is like, hey, we got to train these LLMs on culturally relevant and specific language data, and then we can get those up to speed. But if OpenAI and whoever else is using them, Microsoft, don't see a market incentive to do so, then why would they care about that? You know, so there is a solution, but will it ever happen?
Right.
If no one cares to do it.
Even in English, right? Like you and I both know about hallucinations. So the way in which large language models work, and I put my professor hat on right now, is that you have, it's basically taking text, chopping it up into pieces to turn it into data, and then looking into predictions. This word, Matt, in your podcast series, if I were to do train it on your podcast series,
please do.
Will probably be followed, very likely be followed by Silverman, right? Because in the training data, that's how it goes. It is aping style. It is not in sort of form rather than content. This math and these statistics that feed AI algorithms, right, do not understand the difference between truth and fiction, right? And the issue is that not only, yes, we need better data from different communities, but think about the bias that's already baked into even what data is collected.
Correct.
Think about who's been silenced on the internet.
Yes.
Like, I was talking to some students at Howard University. I was doing a workshop with CUNY, where I teach as well. We had a collaboration. It was like, I'm sure being a Black woman in this room and being on the internet means that no one ever disputes what you say. No one ever gives you crap for being on there and so on. No, think about all the people who've been chased off the internet.
Yes.
And now think about what we've used to train AI. Secondly, think about the world order. There's an incredible incredible data scientist. I will dig up the name for you if you want to interview him sometime. He realized by looking at a Mozilla sheet. So once an algorithm has been set up, it has to be tested with other data just to make sure that it's not racist, problematic, horrible, pornographic or something. Sure. So you use different data to test it. None of the data used in thousands of papers about machine learning and about sort of AI were tested on African data. Like not just countries, the whole continent.
Like left out an entire continent. Cool.
Correct. And one of the scholars in South Africa mentioned that because of the legacy of apartheid and because of colonialism, I think there's a lot of missing languages that are spoken by a majority of South Africans, like Zulu, that is not necessarily digitized or written. And so there's missing training data. And this poor man has been like cobbling together data in Zulu, including, and he mentioned that one of the biggest corpuses, meaning the biggest amounts of text written in Zulu, was the translation of the Jehovah Witnesses of the Bible. So if you had a Zulu chatbot that was trained on that data, it would probably be very religiously biased. Isn't that funny or interesting?
It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm trying to pull it apart here because this is a potentially very ignorant question, but like, are people who don't, okay, bear with me. Are people who speak a language in the world, but who do not write it and do not put it on the internet, are they consuming any content on the internet? And therefore, is this even relevant to their culture? Okay.
I mean, think about it this way. There's a recent story that went around from the New York Times. It was a little viral where I think the bureau chief of their Brazil bureau went to indigenous tribes in remote areas. They hiked for a long time, and he found the Starlink satellite dishes, right? Like that brought Wi-Fi to these particular communities. And I think what was fascinating was just sort of like the idea of how they consumed it, what they immediately sort of latched onto. They had to turn off the internet, right? Because it was consuming too much and it was actually impacting A, whether people wanted to stay in the tribe, and B, whether they wanted to go out hunting. So
why would I hunt when I could play Candy Crush? I mean,
or like watch soccer games or something. And it's not like these communities didn't have smartphones before, but now they have the internet. And so I think what they came to is they turn it off after the mornings and then give it only on Sunday can you access the internet all day. And so it was like a fascinating understanding of like a community adopting the internet at hyper speed, without like being able to sort of slowly mature into it.
Talk about being frozen in amber.
Yeah.
Dropping a literal dinosaur into 2024. Like that's wild.
And so I think a lot of the ways in which we think about technology needs to be stress tested in different communities. And by that, I mean, not just the language part, right? I mean, the cultural part. What do people do to break it, basically? I think that's the thing that people have found OpenAI to be very irresponsible about. They just kind of release it into the wild and we're like, let's see what happens. And of course, whenever we put out a tool, people find ways to break it. And there's been terrible applications of both visual generative AI as well as like written generative AI.
All right. So we've identified this need where there's not enough media serving the Vietnamese language community in the U.S. And there are people who are trying to fix that, but clearly when there's a gap here, we have bad actors, let's call them, diving in to address these communities for what end? That's an open question, I think, financial or otherwise. I have questions about that. Sonia Olala, I don't know if I'm saying that.
Oh
We
la
don't know.
la. It's like the French version of like, oh la la.
Uh-huh. Oh,
Yeah,
okay. So it's like
that's where it's
a
from.
little phrase. Okay.
She says she's from France.
Oh, interesting.
In some of the videos, yeah.
Tell me about her or it. You know what I mean? Like what is going on here, and why is she reaching so many people?
So Sonia Olala is a YouTuber who looks sort of in her maybe 20s, early 30s. And she speaks in Vietnamese. She produces, I think she produces a lot of videos. In 2023, on average, she produced about 8 videos a week, which is a
bananas,
lot. Yeah. I think there were times when she produced 15 in 1 week. And she produces, you can see her, she's sort of like in the frame in front of a green screen that then is filled with a bunch of flashy graphics and like a little ticker on the bottom. And she speaks to the community about news, which she oftentimes mostly speaks about Donald Trump, every little thing that's been happening around him, including random things like, oh, I saw him at a golf tournament and he is so young and sprite. Look at him bending over and picking up a golf ball. Look at how amazingly healthy he is at the tender age of 70 something. And I can't even bend down like that. Like things like that. On top of also mixed in with like some real news that's coming in and out. And so she is someone who, as we found by analyzing the links she cited as her news sources, creates what is called information disorder. So half the links that she cites is the Gateway Pundit, as well as Breitbart and Newsmax. And the Gateway Pundit in particular has been ranked by bipartisan organizations as very misleading.
Yeah.
And then every once in a while, there'll be a link to the AP or Reuters. And you're like, what is happening here? And so she has been talking to the Vietnamese community about news, I think, since 2018. She has a total of 202,000 subscribers on one YouTube channel and about 50 on another. Her videos get an average view of 40,000 viewers, right? Like that's probably a lot more than, I don't know, a lot of people that we know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's been interesting because the way in which I found her was by looking through YouTube history and was like, who is this?
That one of those people who gave you the history that she was in there. Okay. Yeah. Fascinating.
And that's how I knew. I was asking this community member, I was like, do you know Sonia Olala? I looked into her. She cites very problematic sources. Right. And this community member is like, yeah, I know. I mean, like, I like Donald Trump, but this woman likes Donald Trump too much. You know, I know not to trust her.
What's up with that?
I know. And on that side, so the people who don't speak much English and talked about this were like, yeah, we don't know. We just watch her. She comes up in our suggested viewings, right? And then the people who do, like my buoy, the woman who became translated mainstream news, and her friends told me, like, we don't know who she is, but she looks like AI. She looks like we don't understand why she's in the Vietnamese community.
There's some uncanny valley stuff going on here. Yes. For audio listeners, we'll explain what this is, but for video viewers, I'll show her here. You know, we're not going to play a clip, but you can see what we're talking about, where she looks like a young news anchor. But when you really look closely, it's like, is that a human being, or is that a deep fake, or is it a generated person? Oh, I meant to ask you. When you listen to her voice, or when Vietnamese speakers listen to her voice, are they like, that's a weird AI voice? Or are they like, no, that's a person speaking? Because I can see that she looks weird, but I cannot tell if her voice is synthetic or not.
So here's where the story comes in. I sent this to my brother. My brother has been living in Vietnam, sort of like as a second gen immigrant, came back and then started doing a lot of work and has been living in Hanoi for 10 years. He listened to the voice and was like, this woman is not from Vietnam. She has an accent.
Ooh, interesting.
the story is she puts out is that she was born in France and grew up in France and then moved to the US, became a staunch Trump supporter, and that's why her Vietnamese is the way it is.
Okay.
And like everyone is like, it's a weirdly accented Vietnamese, but it's very fluent to some degree. And so they're all like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
And I think most people who I talked to on my boys' friends, like all of those folks, were very alarmed about her because they didn't understand why this woman was peddling so much pro-Trump, right-wing news to the Vietnamese community in the US. And here's the key. If you know of Vietnamese communities, they kind of like know each other. Everyone kind of has heard of one another.
Okay.
They were like, we all know of people in Los Angeles. Why does no one know this woman?
Yeah, that's like, oh. That was such an interesting part of the story. I just want to put a fine point on something so important and fascinating that you said, which was information disarray. What was it?
Disorder. Yeah, there's a woman at Washington University the Washington University School of Information. She's doing her PhD there and studies misinformation and sort of like information flows in the Vietnamese community, and she called it information disorder.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually more effective than just plain old fake news.
Oh,
right?
For sure. That's what struck me about it. Yes.
Yeah, because it actually destabilizes your belief in systems, in sort of publications. And so you're like, is this right or not? I don't know.
Because if you just watch, right-wing conspiracy, whatever, Alex Jones, like that's just like psychotic, stuff that is just coming at you. But the way this YouTube channel is mixing in, like you said, a story from the AP and a story from NPR, and then here's a story from Breitbart, and I'm going to comment on how Donald Trump looks so great. It muddies the waters of like, is this legitimate? Is it, well, she cites this, so it's probably fine. Like, that is insidious and worrisome. It's a new dimension.
That's a new thing that I think folks learned from like the 2016. If misinformation agents have learned something from the 2016 election, it's that fake, completely outright lies that you like put out in the world, they get discovered pretty quickly. Some people have kind of like been trained on the idea that, ooh, this might be fake news, let me Google it. But I think when it comes to sort of like wrapping, I sometimes call it like wrapping a piece of vegetable in bacon. So taking something that's real and then wrapping it with a lot of conspiracy, sort of opinionated, misleading sort of conclusions that you draw on that fact is much harder to dispel.
Yes.
Because the factual part is real. Yes. What conclusions you draw on that is not. And that's really, really hard to counter.
Correct. The most persistent conspiracy theories throughout history have always been wrapped in like, oh, well, this was a thing, but what we're talking about now is like insanity.
Correct.
There's a little bit of speculation in your reporting and in the community of like, who is this woman? Is she synthetic? Is she some amalgamation of whatever, AI, synthetic, whatever? And I'll say, okay, she's got a couple 100,000 YouTube subscribers and getting 40,000 views on a video. That's decent, but she's not making $1 million here. So like, if she's not making a bunch of money and it's all weirdly cobbled together, then there's also some speculation of like, what is the purpose of this and who is doing this? And is this some sort of like nation state actor trying to sow misinformation within certain voter blocks in the US that can have substantial outcomes on the elections?
Right. And I think that's the thing that I think has become a very big sticking point for a lot of folks who look into what is called political influencers. I think I think this has become, in this election cycle especially, become kind of like a big part of how you campaign. Like if Obama and his presidency was the very first, like 2008 election, right? Like was the first instance of people kind of like really pushing for the social media campaigns. This is the campaign where we're looking into multiple ways of accessing political influencers to help you out. And I think one scholar kind of like pointed out that the FTC recently ruled that influencers do not have to disclose whether they're being paid.
Right.
Double check me on that, but there is definitely a law that came out, and that then says, because it's supposedly the public rather than or like a one-on-one,
Like
you chose to like, this is an audience that chose to talk to this particular influencer.
Okay.
And so it's kind of like a two-way street of like, I like you, I follow you, so I don't, this is kind of like my chosen subscription to you rather than a public news institution that has to disclose it. And so it's a very weird and sticky field right now. And I think that's the key: transparency. How do I even, like, the thing that we all get trained as journalists is to say, when I do something false, I make a correction. Sonia Olala has deleted swaths of her content for 4 or 5 months. No explanation, no acknowledgement of that. When we delete as journalists something, we need to tell our audiences. Yeah. We can't even delete things because we have to put a massive update saying, this is now disputed. We can no longer stand by this. So this article is not right? That kind of like accountability and being able to get in touch with the institution is non-existent in the sphere of the internet. I called various numbers that were listed under her address. I looked up the address in Florida, even though she says she lives in like, where does she live? In Los Angeles. I DM'd her. I Facebook messaged her. I commented on her videos. She would never talk to me. Right. And so this is the interesting, shiesty way in which a lot of people can just eschew a lot of scrutiny and transparency while also continuing to make money on the platform. And yes, I don't know if she makes enough money or gets enough views to make a living out of that. But
to make 8 videos a week?
That's a lot.
The amount of work and green screen and graphics and research, I'm putting air quotes for audio listeners, that go into these videos is enormous. And then to publish like 5 to 10 of them weekly. There is a team of people producing these with certainty. And I'm saying they're only getting 40, 50, 100,000 views. Again, that's not nothing, but like, something else is going on with this. No one's making millions of dollars on this. There's some other agenda here. What do I know?
Look, a lot of political influencers at least start out and might still believe and still do things based on their passion.
Right.
But I think what the scholar, Sarah Nguyen is her name, she at the University of Washington School of Information said was that basically there's something fishy going on, because she's not quite like that big studio type of produced piece that you would see from even like an ethnic media sort of conglomerate like SBTN, which is like a Vietnamese Saigon broadcast channel, right? Like that kind of like long established since the 1970s news organization. She's also not like a lowly, I do this on my own, low production value things. There's something in between
between, which is where it's the space that a lot of influencers inhabit and become very successful. But it's just, like you said, it's
at
very
least
fishy.
in some platforms, you have to put in, you know how like on Instagram, like the Washington Post did a great story about dietitians who recommended a certain thing, and they had to put the hashtag ad in.
Yeah.
It's not happening on YouTube. I don't know what's happening with this person.
There are requirements for this, and I should, I didn't do all the homework. So I from my experience, the requirements are there, and perhaps there are laws in place. However, policing it is nearly impossible. Like it's an enforcement issue. It's not necessarily a rules issue. Which leads me to my next question. You said many of her videos are deleted from her channel. Do you have any understanding if her channel, the people behind it, have done the deleting, or were they moderated out by YouTube? And then this is another interesting point of like, if there's no one at YouTube corporate / Google who is a misinformation expert who also speaks Vietnamese, then there is no way for them to mark these videos as misinformation, which is against their terms of service. If you say COVID vaccines put microchips in you, then you will be removed from. If I say that in English, you'll be removed from YouTube. I just realized that this video now will probably be deleted and demonetized. So I'm sorry, everyone. But if there's no one there who speaks the language, how the heck are we gonna deal with this, right?
So it's interesting because we actually brought Sonia Olala to YouTube, and we're like, hey, we were investigating this. This was for the very first story we did in the series,
right,
where we had just kind of like found her, and they were like, Sonia Olala does not go against the terms of service, violate the terms of service of our business. Okay, bye.
And that was it. Kind of like that's all they said.
And it's interesting because like the last time the Vietnamese community was able to do something was when John Oliver did a segment on misinformation in immigrant communities and brought up this one guy. I think his name is King Radio. And they removed his account after John Oliver brought something up.
I know. Well, hey, journalism / comedy.
Well, which he based heavily on other people's reporting that was seeded by other people, right? Like it's this like weird, interesting chain of information.
Yes.
But apparently after like a year or two, this guy just resurfaced on a different platform with a different name,
right,
and is doing the same stuff again. And it's just interesting because like I think the idea of moderating content by person or even through an algorithm is like something that is really not possible,
right?
If you think about how many millions of like hours are being recorded and uploaded every single day.
No.
A, there's not enough people to look at that, and B, there's not enough, like there's stuff you can't train an algorithm on, right?
Right.
And
contextual,
if anything, right,
linguistic information. There's not enough English speakers to police the English stuff, let alone this.
And also one of the things, my research, like I looked a lot into sort of the ways in which online communities are defined by language novelty, right? Like, and like one of the things that I love to cite to my students is that there's a group that during the 2016 election coordinated in like on 4chan would then go to Twitter and Facebook and start seeding new words, including the word Hitlery. Remember Hillary Clinton running for president? And so they were like, this is Hitlery.
It's almost like astroturfing, but for politics.
And how do you know to look for that word if it's a novelty?
If it doesn't, that's fascinating.
The internet is all defined, like how we speak online defines the contours of our communities, and also is a continuously inventive process.
Yes.
And so I mean, like, I don't know how you police that, let alone train an algorithm on that, right?
Right.
How do you start, like, if some people start using codes, like ham sandwich for something, like everyone's gonna talk about ham sandwiches suddenly. You don't understand why, but like this is a new code for like bullying people or whatnot.
Yes.
The
speed of cultural context is so fast and complicated that it's, this conversation is reminding me that like we will never have algorithms that can decode this stuff in real time at the speed of human conversation, especially on the internet. It's a fascinating dimension that, I wish and hope that LLMs and AI and stuff can remove the drudgery of some of tasks and aid journalists of like, hey, I have 10 billion hours of video to watch for this report. That's very important. Wouldn't it be great for an algorithm to just surface relevant stuff so that I, a human, can decode it? That's great. That's a good use of this technology, but it's so fraught and it's so limited, and maybe forever.
It's so problematic because there's also, of course, for every tool, there's a yin and a yang. There's always like a pro and a con. Like there's a democratization of publication means that really helps us like diversify our views and understanding of things. So it's like, I struggle with this. And so I think in terms of the ways in which I tackle this is to try and teach caution and sort of critical thinking within consumption of this, and what I call a proactive approach to news consumption, which is not to say don't use Facebook, but like really like one of the things that I kind of like discovered by talking to the Vietnamese community was that they would let recommendation algorithms just kind of recommend videos that they will watch. And I said that this kind of like, it's almost like letting the algorithm choose information for you is allowing it to only feed you to dessert when you actually need a balanced meal, and to then be proactive about choosing things and just kind of being like, here are the 4 or 5 things that I now trust over time. That is something that I think is really helpful and important.
I love the food analogy. That's really good.
I have a whole slide for it. It's really culturally appropriate.
Please share it. All right, we have to take a break. Hopefully you have a little more time to hang.
Yes.
Okay. But before we take a break, listeners have demanded that we bring back a trivia question for all of our guests.
Okay.
The
it's
stakes.
One or how many?
It's only one. It's multiple choice. The stakes could not be higher. If you get this right, I will pay for your PhD in journalism or information studies.
Oh God, I probably won't know.
Do you have a master? Where are you educationally? A master's?
I have a master's.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll go full PhD if you get this right. If you get it wrong, it's a total embarrassment.
Sure.
Okay. So in researching this week's episode, I learned that linguists call Vietnamese an isolating language. Does this sound familiar to you? Or
tell me more.
Okay. This means that most words only contain one morpheme, not morphine, the painkiller, morpheme. A morpheme, as I understand it, a layperson is a little bit like a syllable. It's a unit of language which cannot be subdivided into smaller parts and still have meaning. So in English, we would say we have a lot of morphemes in our language. So the word incoming can be divided into in, come, and ing. That's a morpheme. Apparently, Finnish and Japanese also use a lot of morphemes in their words. So given that so many words in Vietnamese only contain one morpheme, today's trivia question is, how many letters are in the longest Vietnamese word? Or to put it another way, what is the longest Vietnamese word that can be written without a space? So I have 3 choices for you. You're looking for the number of letters. You don't have to guess the word because that would be bananas. A, is it 7 letters? B, 8 letters? Or C, 9 letters? What is the longest single word?
You can give me choices.
Yeah. So you can mull this over. You can think out loud. And I'm always worried about, I used to ask this of the hosts of the previous incarnation of the show where we would just like have fun. But when I ask this of experts and guests who are in the field, I'm like, oh, I wonder if they'll know this right away or if I could stump them. So
no, for example, the most common Vietnamese last name is actually Nguyen, is Nguyen.
I read that, yes.
But that's only 6. So I presume there's maybe 1 or 2 letters that you can add to that. But
isn't it like 50% of the population has that last name or something very substantial? I don't want to put the wrong stat out there, but
don't put the wrong stat out of there because I don't know. I know.
But it's like
I don't want to do that.
Like so many people in Vietnam.
I'm like Nguyen. I'm just trying to figure out like if I've even seen it. Monosyllabic. I'm gonna go with. I'm like, can you add 2 or 3 more letters to that? Like Nguyen is
the
like
wheels
the
are
longest,
turning.
8.
Okay. Lam picks 8. Choice B, 8 letters. We will find out if she is correct after this important.
God damn it!
Right. It's time for me to thank all of the Patreon supporters at all tiers over at patreon.com/influencepod. You can make a contribution of just $1 every month if this show brings value to you and you want to keep it going, keep the lights on, so to speak. A $1 contribution is enormous. It's way better than advertising. And so, consider that. Consider a $5 contribution. You get other perks. Consider a $10 contribution. And that means you get your name read on not just this episode, but every single episode of Influence the Podcast with me, Matt Silverman. So I'm here to thank those executive producers at the $10 or more level. They are Deborah Duberpants, James Dozier, Ken M., Shane, Wesley Cordell, Allie, Bowie Barks, Dominic Kerr, Jerry Duran, Jessica Kybell, Kathy Phillips, Matthew Scott, Duran, and, of course, William. There are some cool things to unlock over at the Patreon, including ad-free episodes, Patreon chat access, where patrons of the show can hang out in an exclusive chat. And of course, perks like this, where you can be part of the episodes every week. And I also, if you don't want to contribute any money, but you want to just subscribe to the show, algorithm free, just get new episodes and updates and feature guests coming right into your inbox. You can subscribe for free. And it's basically like a newsletter or a blog. Remember those things? Remember blogs? It's kind of like that. And then you don't have to worry about, is the app going to suggest me my favorite show this week? It's like, no, if you want it, you can subscribe directly. So check it out, patreon.com/influencepod. And now, after a brief break, we have to get back and see if Lam is going to get the trivia question right. We have returned. I'm here with Lam Vo, investigative journalist, data journalist, and trivia answerer. We were asking what Vietnamese word has the most letters, or how many letters are in the longest Vietnamese word. The choices were 7, 8, or 9. She picked B, 8 letters. I always give guests a chance to reconsider their answer after the break. Are you going to stick
Don't
with
do
8?
that. Just keep going.
All right.
Don't prolong attention.
Okay. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to type the word into the chat here. Viewers will not be able to see this, but I'm going to type it in to reveal the answer to Lam, and hopefully she can pronounce this for us, because I certainly cannot.
Uh-oh.
Okay, and there are punctuation marks here that I'm leaving out.
Oh, that's gonna be hard then. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. No, I almost went for 7.
The correct answer is 7. Do you know how do you say this word?
I don't, because it doesn't have phonetics on it.
So
I almost went with 7 because I was like, how can you put more than Nyang? Okay.
Only on the E.
Yeah,
I don't even know what
you
call it. There's a little caret above the E.
Yeah. It's so those things are called diacritics, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. And they're basically, I think, the Portuguese, it wasn't the French, but like one colonizer came and was like, you should not use the alphabet that Chinese use, you have to use the Latin alphabet. And so
interesting.
There's actually 9 tones in Vietnamese. Like Mandarin has 4, right? Like
okay.
Which is a simplified Chinese. I think Vietnamese and Cantonese have an appropriate, like similar amount of tones. And so Nyang, man, I almost went for 7. I was like, that's too little. That was too little. Because Nguyen is like, you can really only add one more thing in there.
Wait, to clarify, does this mean that Vietnamese speakers write with Latin characters, or are they using Asian
the Latin characters with different accents on it? Yeah.
But if a native speaker were to like write a handwritten note to a friend or family member, would they be using Latin characters?
Yes, with
interesting,
because that's basically the whole conversion. And then if you look at, so one fun thing that you can do is you can, let's see, who is sanitized so that I can text them, but I can just do this. So you can, one of my favorite things to do is like to have different keyboards on here. And so if you want to see
showing her phone to the camera for those audio listeners, but we'll talk about
I don't know
what
if you
this
can
is.
see, but like, so for example, if I put the E here, there's all of these different accents that I can put on the E.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think
and so
that's available. I mean, yes, I have that on with certain button presses. You can get those things.
Yeah. So these are the Latin, if that makes sense, like those are the Latin characters with the signage or diacritics on top of them.
Right.
That indicates tonality.
So,
yeah. And so Nyang, I think, is what this is. It's like, I think tilted, if I'm not mistaken.
Do you do you know the definition of this word? I have it here, but you might
I think
know
it's
better
tilted, right? Google Translate.
Oh, tilted?
I think so. Yeah.
My
Let me see.
understanding was that it means, oh,
Leaning.
yes, inclined or to lean.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds right. Lean.
So that
Lean.
apparently that is the longest single morpheme word.
I was
But
close.
but what I learned from the research too was that this word can be reduplicated, so you can say it twice for.
Ying ying.
Is that like an emphasis, or is that a new meaning of the word?
Maybe it's leaning crooked. I think
Oh,
that could
like
be the way. Again,
leaning.
heritage
Like
speaker,
that's
5-year-old.
interesting. Yeah.
But leaning
Okay.
crooked. But I mean, there's so many fascinating parts about language, that particular language, Vietnamese. Like when I say I have to situate myself in like relation to the speaker, which then gives oftentimes patriarchal and age cues to who I am. So I don't say I. There's no word for I really, like in the same equivalent as in English. You say, for example, if I speak to an elder, I say gong, which means is the same word for child, gong. And I say child and then ba, which is older lady, right? And so I situate myself in comparison to the older lady, right? And so how people address me is dependent on who is talking to me. And so there's like ongoing jokes among younger people when they start calling me. So sometimes they call me Jay, which is older sister, or Go, which is woman, like miss, right? And then there's ba. When kids start calling me ba, it means that I'm an old lady. And I'm like, oh shit.
It's like when someone calls you ma'am in English.
Yes.
You're like, oh boy.
Right. And because like my father was 1 of 13, and like it's not uncommon to speak to people of that generation who have like 6, 10 siblings and so on, right? There is a big age gap between my father and he's the oldest and the youngest auntie, right? And so I have cousins who are the equivalent of my nieces who are older than me, and then have children who are maybe a little younger than me and call me old lady because of the hierarchy of the family.
Right.
Is great.
But that's purely contextual. I love learning about the concept of high context and low context languages. Where, and I what I understand just as a cursory 10,000 foot view is like many Asian languages are high context like that, which is Japanese, and it sounds like Vietnamese too, where like I guess English is fairly low context of like you just say what you mean. You just say, give me that, get past the potatoes or whatever. But like in other languages, it's like I am a certain class, age, relationship to the person who is past, who I'm requesting the potatoes of, and all of that has to be built into the request. Otherwise, I will be shunned or made fun of or whatever.
Or you're just being disrespectful.
Or disrespectful, yes.
Yeah.
There
is a way of saying you when you're not disrespectful, but sort of like in a casual way, and it's my. And so if you want to say you're stupid as a cow, you say "mày ngu như con bò."
I'm totally going to be using that around the house later today.
Yeah.
You've given us so much to think about and so much context. We live in New York, and we have the pleasure of having many friends and family and coworkers and such who are immigrants or part of immigrant communities. And like as a regular old white guy, I presume that so many immigrant communities are progressive, that people of color and immigrants are generally progressive because they've come through hardship, or they are trying to make a better life for their communities, and that they would care about things like social safety nets or healthcare or I don't know, gun control, whatever the issue might be. And I'm wondering if that is a myth or if that is a misperception, because as you've identified, like, these are people who are very savvy and very sophisticated to the point where they're consuming really far right information and misinformation, and they're getting that news constantly from these sources, which is not good. But they're simultaneously saying like, "Oh yeah, I know this is mostly bullshit, but this is all I got." Like that is a much more complicated picture of like a political voting bloc than I would ever be able to perceive.
And I think one of the things that people might not think about enough is sort of like immigration can sometimes come from an economically motivated
Right.
place, but also sometimes comes from a very traumatic space,
Yeah.
right? Right now, we have a lot of asylum seekers in the US. We have people who are persecuted based on their identity or their political leanings and so on. But we also have people, many layers of generations of people who came from wars, war zones, and so on, right? Like we have a whole host of like Ukrainian refugees. We will have a lot of refugees from Gaza, and
Right.
we have had a lot of in Germany. We've had a lot of migrants from all kinds of situations. Afghanistan is an ongoing refugee crisis, right? Like in many ways. So we have people who come from particular traumas with particular timelines and narratives that were frozen in time. And even within each community, you have tiny sub communities, right?
Yeah.
In the Vietnamese community, we have people who may have come before the war ended,
Right.
and may have come in more sort of like official ways, and that could be people who worked with the Southern Vietnamese government that was more aligned with maybe, I don't know, Western policies and so on, and that is also deeply Catholic. And so maybe those folks are single issue voters.
Wow,
right?
I didn't realize it was so Catholic.
It's French colonization. There's a lot of
I
like
guess that makes
in
sense.
colonies. There's a lot of like sort of perpetuation of like religion as well, and sort of divide and conquer kind of like strategies where like some people were elevated, some people were not, and so on. Then you have people who came at the end of the war, so people who were like, oh no, northern Vietnam is about to take over. I've been in Saigon this whole time. I was a general for the Southern Vietnamese whatchamacallit, army. I'm about to be imprisoned. And then you've probably seen the images of people being crammed into planes and boats and so on, and went to the US during that inflection point of Vietnamese history. And then you have people coming later in the 1990s, which came after like my uncle, as I mentioned, was a political prisoner. He was a general in the Southern Vietnamese army, and was, after he married his wife at the tender age of 20 something, and was immediately put into political prison for 5 years. And he like tells me things like, I ate a bowl of rice every day.
But
That
he
was
was
all I had.
imprisoned. Why? Because he said
Because
certain
the
things,
North
or
won, and
yeah.
he was part of the Southern Vietnamese
Oh,
army.
okay. So just because he was enlisted, that was just everyone
Yeah.
goes to prison. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of the ways in which like and I think that's also part of like sort of the media blackout, and sort of the stop of, once the US is no longer involved, they tend to not talk about the histories that come after, in large part also because Vietnam also closed off. It became a communist socialist republic. It is still a socialist republic if you actually go back, and you'll see a lot of propaganda and sort of like socialism. Same way with China, sort of fiscally probably more capitalist, very socially, like politically socialist. And then based on that, he came in the 90s after having endured a lot of like sort of mistreatment. So each group comes with a different policy, and thus has a very different, whether it's trauma or sort of narrative that informs how they vote. So imagine a whole group of political asylees who were imprisoned during communism in Vietnam coming to the US. They're going to be pro-military. They're going to be pro like freedom. They want just as much freedom as they want. Maybe that's their draw to Donald Trump and that's the problem.
The conservative
with, like,
Republican narrative feeds into that, even though it doesn't necessarily serve it doesn't empower their interests. That's
and maybe it does. I don't know. I mean, like, there's a lot of. I think there's a lot of ways in which also the two parties U.S. system leaves little room for people to actually showcase why they're voting for whom they're voting for. I think, again, coming from Germany, having grown up in Germany, I remember like looking at the ballot for the elections and being like, what? There were so many parties. There's one party called the Pirate Party that is all about like freedom of the internet. And I'm like, okay. I think I remember seeing it's called Tierschutzpartei, I think, if I'm not mistaken. There was a poster for basically like an animal rights party that you can vote into parliament. They might not get enough votes, but you have choices. And so most of German government has to build coalitions between different parties. So you might vote for the more progressive Green Party that will then have to be more work with the center left. But like that is more of a way of understanding voters than to then be like they are only pro Trump or only pro Biden, because like
it feels like if the fringe party that you support can get some votes but not win, but then be gathered up into a larger coalition, then I feel like my vote wasn't wasted. Whereas if you vote for a third party candidate in the US, it's kind of like, well, you're just not voting for the person who's going to win, and therefore we got to just.
And you never know. I mean, like, there's a great piece that someone did at the New York Times. I think he's now at ProPublica. He's an Asian American journalist, a data reporter who looked into New York City and how they voted in 2020 and how they voted in 2022.
Okay.
And it went starkly from very, very Democratic to very Republican because of a specific issue. And it was in New York City's Chinatowns, especially. There was a lot of anti-Asian attacks.
Right. Yes.
And they saw, and that coincided with a movement towards abolitionism. And I think a lot of a lot of people who have to live with the real consequences of inequality, of people and drug use, and sort of like people coming into areas like Chinatown where food is cheap, and there's a lot of also, I think there's disproportionate amounts, from what I understand, of like shelters. And I will say, do not equate crime with shelters for homeless people.
Course.
But I think there's just a lot of like social issues that, on top of like people during the pandemic falling through the cracks who needed psychiatric help, right? That created events like Michelle Go, who was a woman who I think she was the person who was pushed into the tracks at Times Square. There was another person who was followed into her apartment in Chinatown and then stabbed multiple times and so on. Those viral incidences of anti-Asian hate that came coupled with like a general like Kung flu, China virus kind of narrative during COVID with inequality, all of that actually led to a lot of assaults against people who were of Asian descent in Chinatowns, and that scared the living bejeebus out of like a lot of Asian communities, who then potentially moved rightwards. And I can't say that that's the only reason, but potentially may have been impacted by this to then vote Republican,
because they wanted to vote for like law and order police, pro-police candidates to keep them safe.
Correct.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I remembered when I did reporting about this issue in Chinatown, in New York City in particular, but also other Chinatowns, like I spoke to Asian folks in the Bay Area as well, is that I think there is a deterrent when there's a cop on the street to not go in and push and shove people.
Sure.
Does that solve the problem overall? I don't know, right? Like what is the right solution is a different matter, but
the narrative that Asian people brought COVID and infected us all was perpetuated by far right sources. So it's this, they're double dipping on the like, we poisoned the well, we scared everyone, it is causing violence, and now vote for us so we can stop the violence. It's really dark.
Yes. So I think I mean, like, even then, who knows? People might change their minds. I think having talked to voters through my reporting a lot and trying to figure out, there's so many issues. Like, who knows? Maybe for some people, reproductive rights might override something else, right? Yeah. For, let's say, the Catholic Vietnamese community, abortion rights might be much, much bigger than having sort of like the economic freedom that the Republican Party sort of like offers. Or maybe it's like about who needs to be tough on what kind of like immigration. Is it too much? Is it right? There's a lot of beef between like different generations of immigrants right now in terms of like, well, we came here legally, what happened here, and so on. Like, it's very complex, and I think it's really hard to paint people with one like brush. I think generally because of the policies that a lot of people rely on, a lot of immigrant groups tend to, I think, lean more left because there's a lot more social sort of programs that they are exposed to as soon as they come to the country, right? for me, for my parents, my mom came as a refugee. My father was I think he was allowed to stay in Germany after the Vietnam War ended because he was afraid of prosecution if he came back. And so for them, there were a lot of policies that benefited them, and they became very progressive through that stage. And they also learned enough German. They were very isolated as Vietnamese people. There were not as many, and so they were forced to learn a lot of German, and so to kind of like figure it out. And so they were able to find out a lot about like progressive policies and vote in that direction and so on. But who knows? I mean, like maybe local politics also is very slightly different, right? Like we have like, who's that guy with the sweatshirt who had a stroke? The Democratic Pennsylvania dude.
Oh,
do you remember him?
Right.
The bald guy.
It sounds familiar.
John something. A very generic name. But he is also someone who kind of like is more center left, I think. And maybe he was more of a candidate for Asians in Philadelphia if he also understands that security and safety is an issue, right? I think there's a complexity to all of this that cannot be encapsulated in one choice, one political choice, especially in a two-party democracy.
Yep. I could talk with you for 3 more hours. It's been a pleasure. My final questions are sort of how can we this grandmother who is translating and people like her, you know, journalists like yourself, people like her who are concerned citizens who want to bring valuable contextful news to immigrant communities, like, can they start a GoFundMe or a Patreon or something? Is there a way for them who are influencers, essentially, to, you know, keep the lights on and make it worthwhile? Or could she hire in your article, you talked about how like she can do the translation and she can source the material, but like she's not great at video editing. So like, could we pair her up with a video editor that can make, you know, just like $10 an hour just to like, do a service, you know what I mean?
Trust me, we tried. We were like, "Can you do this?" And she's like, "No, I'd rather do it myself." And so on.
Real? Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But I guess I mean, like, would the community pay a little? If it could a community of 50,000 people kick in $1 to make sure that their news was good and they get it from a trusted grandma that they love? You know what I mean?
How about I bring this to her because she's also very keen on retiring after the election.
Hang on, just hang on a few more months, please.
And she has 3 kids, and those kids also just had kids, and she loves being a grandma. She's like part-time like nanny to a lot of her grandchildren. So I think in many ways she kind of like is trying to slowly weasel her way out. But what I will say is that if you want to put money towards an institution that does a wonderful job, like my story is incredible. But I think an institution that does great work is called Viet Fact Check. And they have been putting together a WhatsApp line. And so I think the beauty is that, or the sad part is that big tech created a problem for many communities around the world that are now being solved by volunteers in these small communities that do it without any compensation.
Right.
And so I think Viet Fact Check is an actual like dedicated nonprofit that has someone that gets paid to do that. And I think that would be great to move towards. I'm like taking her to Austin. I'm paying for you to come here and you can have your walk. I hope you speak in front of the crowd. I want you to speak in front of the crowd if we get to have a speech or something. And I want you to have that thing, you know, awards are just like big, like things you can rest on paper and then the paper doesn't fly away. But I want her to have this, and I want her to have that experience. You know, I think for someone who was a mother and a software engineer in like closed offices for her whole life, that is kind of like a very exciting thing to do in retirement. And I think maybe we can see whether she wants it. I'm happy to tap her. Multiple people have tried to push help onto her, but she doesn't want it. So
like,
I would
let's just help
deflect.
with the things that she doesn't want to do. You know, she can still have total control. She just needs a little volunteer team. It's making me think of like wiki culture, you know, that, and we have covered it on the show many times of like, Wikipedia is a miracle, and it is such because there was a conscious choice not to never monetize and never put advertising, and to create a community of volunteers who just care that information is factual, and it's not perfect and it's not, foolproof, but somehow we created a repository of mostly English language knowledge that is very reliable.
Yeah.
And so the model exists. It's not exactly, you can't do it at the speed of news, but when someone dies, it's on Wikipedia and sourced within seconds,
I do think there's like a rule in news that like kind of like messes up how we educate the public. I think there's this idea of like it needs to be new and it can't have been covered by anyone else before.
Yeah.
Right? Like this idea, I've heard this from editors over and over again. In journalism, you're like, do a search. If someone's done it before, you can't do it. I'm like, in this media, that might have been true when we had like 5.
When there were 3 newspapers, yes.
Correct. Now we have no newspapers, right? And I think the other thing that I really love, and I actually think that some news institutions do a really great job of that, is that we need to do more service journalism that we can then resurface.
Yeah.
And one genius institution that I really love is called Documented. They started out by serving Spanish-speaking, largely undocumented immigrants in New York City. They signed them all up for a WhatsApp group, started out with 250. Now they're at 6,000 who get information there. And what they learned is that questions that were asked of these reporters repeated. And so they were like, you know what? We're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different service journalism pieces that are helping you navigate, like housing, help you navigate how to get free food, help you navigate all of these things and connect you to jobs and so on. And we're going to put that onto a little WhatsApp menu so that whenever you text us, that's the first thing you see. And there's like 5 things. And let's say, I think 75 to 80% of the work, of the questions that people had once they entered the group were answered through that. Yeah. But once they had all of those questions answered, people could be like, oh, okay, that's not quite what I'm looking for. Here's what's happening to me. Okay. And through that, they found many, many stories that were ongoing in the community that no one else had seen.
Right.
While serving them the repeat information they need.
And meeting them on the platform that they are using constantly to be in touch with friends, family, work, etc.
Right. And if we think about this, like there's a really great parallel to like public health, right? Like public health officials have to give you vital information that you use to stay healthy and like not go insane. To some degree, journalism is... And the kind of work that we produce is supposedly this kind of like information that is helping us stay mentally sane and sort of like make healthy choices in a democracy.
Democratic health, yes.
Right. And think about it this way. When it comes to public health, do you remember how to do the Heimlich maneuver every time you need to do it? Probably not. Right? But do you see a poster of that in every single restaurant? Yes. Should we have a little like media literacy pop-up every time we go onto Facebook? Why not? Like here's how you can comport yourself online.
Just
wait a minute, right?
Just reminding you that the Heimlich maneuver exists, even if I don't know how to do it perfectly, is more than not having the poster.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
Or even like fire extinguisher. You don't need it all the time.
Right.
But when something horrible happens, you might need it. And that's the hardest thing. When do you give people the information they need at that point in time? How do you make people understand here's misinformation? Or like this post might make you feel a lot of things. Here are some things to keep in mind. I think some platforms have started doing that.
They're starting to do that, but on their own volition. But I love this analogy because those are restaurants that are private businesses, but they are required, I assume, by law to say, if someone's choking, here's the poster. So imagine if we required, to your point, Meta, WhatsApp, Facebook, Google, YouTube, to say, hey, by the way, if you see weird shit on here, maybe get a second source on this. Just reminding you.
when we see things go viral and they seem very inflammatory and they seem to attract, let's say, look, if you want to try an LLM to see inflammatory reactions to something and then be like, bloop, bloop, this post seems to be going viral. Here are some good best practices when it comes to media literacy to keep in mind.
God. It's not going to solve it, but
no,
it will create so much more awareness than we have now among just regular people.
Right.
I love this idea. All right, we got to go. Lam and I are going to go petition the U.S. government to regulate tech platforms.
Yes.
This is so wonderful. Thank you for spending all this time talking about this. What are you working on next, and where can listeners read, subscribe, follow anything that you're working on?
So I'm working with with the Markup is also documented in the future, but really, like, I'm a free agent thanks to my main job is being a professor, so I get to report with many different institutions, and so I'll still be working with the Markup, but also with documented, just because those two seem like a perfect marriage. And I'm looking into more misinformation stories in immigrant circles, especially surrounding migrants coming to New York. And so we just published a first part of that on the Markup with documented and The Guardian about a Chinese migrant who got the idea of coming to New York City and to the US at large by watching TikTok videos of a family crossing the Darien Gap, a very dangerous crossing.
Where's the Darien Gap?
The Darien Gap is, let me get the countries right. It's in Central America. And it's what the Darien Gap, one second. It's a crossing where that a lot of migrants use. It's a geographic region that connects the American continent, stretching across southern Panama and the northern portion of Colombia.
Okay.
And so a lot of people, if you look it up, a lot of people actually go through that passage to get to the US.
Okay.
Like this Chinese migrant went through South America,
okay.
Then walked through this hike through wilderness and jungle and mountains and like water to get to the US
because they thought it was a viable passage, or that it would be like exciting
because
or fun?
They saw it on TikTok.
Okay.
And on TikTok, or the Chinese version of TikTok. And there was a family of 3 that did that. And they had it to exciting music. And they were like, we are marching to the US for a better life. And this guy was like, he mentioned to us that he was a homosexual in China. And he didn't feel like his family really accepted him. His life was very monotonous. He was very depressed in China. He felt very isolated. And he was like, this looks like the most exciting type of life. Little did he know that at every corner and every turn as he was making his journey out there, he was facing new perils. People tried to steal his stuff. He was having to bribe folks. He was being like mugged, and like I think several Chinese migrants had died trying to do the same path that he did, and so on.
Yeah. So this TikTok, this glorified version of this pathway, which was like, yay, this is we're going to a better life, was just, I don't know. It's not. It's a form of misinformation. It's like, it's like watching a Hollywood movie, and thinking that you can be a superhero. I don't. I'm trying to get the analogy.
Except it's real people,
but it's real
on TikTok.
Yes.
That are being fed into your algorithm.
Yes.
To continuously, like, once you go down the rabbit hole, that's all you get, right?
Correct.
It's like, oh, look, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it. And so it's this interesting question of like, how much is it influence? How much is it predisposition? But it's a very interesting conundrum nowadays.
Fascinating.
Anyhow, that's what I'm working on.
Excellent.
I'm editing stories. I'm writing some stories. I'm looking at data. It's fun.
We will link
or
to
like
all.
A little depressing.
well, maybe last question. How do you stay positive when you have to look at all these disheartening things for your job?
I mean, people like my boy, right? Like, I think one of the things that I like to tell my friends is that they're like, you look at all of these terrible things. How do you do it? The people who connect me to other human beings, let's say people who have been impacted by misinformation, people who have been hurt by certain institutions and so on, are usually people who help those folks.
Yeah.
So I look at terrible things guided by human beings who do amazing work. And I think oftentimes, like, think about social workers, teachers, and people who do this kind of labor, they they carry the weight of, let's say, 90% of the world's problem are carried by 10% of the population.
Yep.
You got to treasure those folks, and they do incredible stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of go through the world being like, you know what? You are someone, I am not alone. We are all doing something, right? And because I also do service and solutions journalism, I try to also focus on ways in which I can empower people. I don't want to just tell you don't look at YouTube. I want to tell you, if you want to look up YouTube, choose these things.
Right.
And then having like an auntie tell me with a big giggle that she was able to successfully install Google Translate on her phone and that she is like excited to use it is a very different feeling than just like putting it out there and then just kind of like walking away.
Yep. I love it. Lam Thuy Vo. Hopefully I got it right. Close?
Close enough.
Thank you so much for being my guest on Influence. This is a fantastic conversation.
Of course. Have a good day.
Thank you to everyone watching and listening. I love this episode so much. Thank you to Lam Vo for being my guest again. She's extraordinary. I really could have spent a lot more time talking to her about the media business and journalism and disinformation. If I leave you with one thing, it is information disorder, a term that I had not heard until reading her pieces and talking with her just now. It is a new dimension of, media weaponization that I just didn't think about. Mixing in credible sources with unreliable sources to purposely sort of mislead and confuse. It's not good, but I also really love her advice about, that algorithms will only serve you dessert. If you are only consuming dessert in your food diet, you're gonna have a bad time. But it's so easy to get dessert. It's just so much easier to get the cookies. So we have to work harder to get the fruits and vegetables and the proteins that we need in a balanced diet. And we have to work harder. All of us individually and in our communities, as Lam was pointing out, we just have to put in the work to have a more diverse and healthy media diet, because algorithms will never serve us hard-hitting journalism, 1,200 words about, disinformation or, war zones or whatever. It's just, you're not going to get that. You got to seek it out, and you have to find trusted sources to get that balanced diet. So the onus is on platforms. Well, the onus is on governments to start requiring platforms to moderate and label the content, to put that Heimlich maneuver sign up in front of inflammatory stuff. But I just don't have a ton of confidence that will be enforceable or that it will even happen. So get your media vegetables and try to help people in your community. That could just be the people you hang out with online and play video games with. That could be your linguistic community or your immigrant community. So if you see something passing through the WhatsApp chat that's like, I don't know about that, see if you can find a way without criticizing the person who is sharing it to say, maybe check out this, or maybe you shouldn't be, maybe you should get another source on that sort of thing. It's hard. I'm not sure how you talk to loved ones about this stuff. It's a very hard problem for our time. If you found this episode or this show useful, I hope that you will subscribe in your favorite podcast app and come on back, because the guests I have are lining up and they're all freaking cool. This is my pledge to you. No one is coming on this show unless they're fucking cool as shit. That could just mean that they're really funny. That could mean they are fighting the good fight about, saving the internet or protecting democracy, or, they've just built something that is extraordinary. Like every single person I've talked to so far, I've already recorded a bunch of other episodes. They blow my mind in a little way, in very different ways each time. So if your mind is getting blown a little bit, if you're having a laugh, or you're thinking about the internet a little bit differently each time you listen, I do hope you'll subscribe. If you're an audio listener, we have a YouTube channel. That's where the video version goes. And also you'll get like short clips and things like that that kind of tease the episodes or tee up the topics so that you can check them out. It would be wonderful if you hop over to the YouTube channel to subscribe there, or even just throw like a like or watch one of the videos as a video version rather than just audio, because it kind of, look, we've been talking about algorithms. We need a little bit of heat on that channel to get the ball rolling. One of the recent episodes was starting to do very well because people were coming in. So if you are a longtime listener of the show, or you're a new listener and you enjoy the audio version, hop on over to youtube.com/influencepodcast, or click the link in the description of this show. Even if you're not a video podcast watcher, just throwing a subscribe on the channel will be really valuable at this stage in the show's development. I know you think hitting one button is probably not going to do much. It really will help the show. So thank you so much. And of course, you can just subscribe to the whole thing algorithm free by heading over to patreon.com/influencepod, where there are ad-free episodes and perks. But if you just want to get a newsletter in your inbox and get the show every single time and updates about it, you'll get it right there through the Patreon. So it's your one-stop shop. Thank you to Lam again for being an extraordinary guest. I'm very excited about next week's show, and I think I will tease a little bit of that on the Patreon as well. But for now, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and please practice safe internet wherever you may roam. Talk at you next week.